right, I see we've got a very nice crowd with us today, so thank you everyone for joining us. A couple of quick housekeeping things. Would love it if people would just go in and maybe into the chat feature and introduce yourself and maybe the name of your company or something just fun about you. Make this a much more interactive presentation. We love to make those, have these things be interactive and not just a bunch of talking heads up here. I'm very excited today to be speaking with our two panelists. The goal or the topic of today's session is achieving sales mastery through virtual sales training and reinforcement. And this is fabulous because in the last 18 months or so, we've seen sales training really pick up. Maybe it's in the startup community, maybe it's becoming a more affordable thing, maybe it's that people are finally understanding that you can teach and coach and train to this in a better way, and you don't have to be IBM or Microsoft to be able to afford sales training and coaching. So I'm really excited to hear about it, and I love the fact that it's going to be about virtual training because it is an expensive thing if you're not too careful, but it is so critical and important. And so we've got two fantastic leaders with us today. First person I want to introduce is Mike Kunkle. Mike is the Senior Director of Sales Readiness at Brainshark, and so I think that he's got a tremendous real-world approach to explaining the situations and the challenges and then talking about practical solutions. On top of that, we have Tim, and Tim, please correct me if I mispronounce this, Riesterer?
It's Riesterer. It's much easier than it looks, actually.
It is. I apologize, Tim. And he is this Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer at Corporate Visions. So I'm very excited to have both of you. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, no problem. So one of the things, again, for people who might be new to Sales Hacker, please, as you have questions throughout this presentation, go ahead and ask them. We'll monitor the channel for questions and make sure that they're asked in a timely response. Obviously, we will have a little bit of a Q&A at the end, but if there's something really pertinent to the way the conversation's going, we do like to tackle those things early on and head on and make it a very, very interactive conversation. So without further ado, let's sort of jump right into this. And I guess maybe, the first question is, why are organizations doing or considering virtual training today for sales? What, and I'll let Mike or Tim, you guys can each sort of speak to that.
All right, I'll go first, Tim, because you've got some slides to go through. I'll just share my experiences here. Tim has got some great research he's going to walk through, but I network with a lot of sales enablement pros, and it seems to me that organizations are considering virtual training for some of the right reasons and a couple concerning ones. So the one thing I hear a lot, downtime and opportunity loss are the biggest reasons that I hear cited, for considering virtual training over other forms of training, especially classroom training. I mean, if I had $1 for every time I heard, I can't have my reps out of the field, my retirement portfolio would look a lot better right now. Right? Now, given how little of their time reps spend selling from the research that we see, I think the reasons that we hear this is because training doesn't usually produce a bottom line improvement. If it did, we'd be hearing more things like, hey, when can you train my team again, right? But, that's the most common thing I hear. Coupled with time issues, travel savings is another big reason. I also hear a lot of the millennial stuff spouted right now, and I don't personally buy everything I hear about how we need to train millennials differently, but I do believe that some of what I hear is how we should have been training everyone all along. I just worry a little bit that if we're not careful, we'll have a self-fulfilling prophecy in our hands where we'll produce a generation of attention deficit business people who can't focus long enough to solve complex business problems. So I don't buy everything I hear about that. But this is a reason that I've heard that companies are interested in moving more toward virtual or digital training. And then occasionally I hear, hey, I'd like to spend less time in the classroom and do more field training and coaching, which in my mind, if executed well, can really be a big win and a wonderful complement to virtual training, especially if you get everybody aligned around the content and the field training and coaching support what's being taught virtually. So those are some of the big things that I hear. What about you, Tim?
Well, thanks, Mike. We did do some research. We partnered with Sales Management Magazine and Training Magazine and went out to their database and asked a few questions, and we had 274 companies respond. And the first question we asked them, as we tried to get a feel for where the state of training was today, skills training for salespeople, we asked them, how confident are you that your salespeople are getting the skills training that they need? And it turns out that 79%, or 4 out of 5 companies, said they believe they are not getting their salespeople the skills training that they need. So there's a bit of a crisis that people feel like there's more that needs to be done, and it's the vast majority of companies. So to your point earlier, that begged the question, why? And so we've got some data to support what you were saying you were hearing. By far, the largest number was blamed on time out of field. 56% of the people said it's because we can't take people out of the field, and 37% said it was budget limitations. So there's clearly an interesting level of pressure, and we think we now found out where that pressure is coming from when we then identified, now who is the final determinant of what training your salespeople go through, and it's their managers. So managers are choosing the training or learning path from, let's say, a curriculum that the company provides for their team. So we think there's a little bit of the fox in the hen house, or conflict of interest here, because those same managers are the ones who are primarily charged with building pipeline, and keeping people in the field doing their job becomes a tension to be managed with the desire to get them trained. And again, most training takes people out of the field today. So it's that pressure then that led us to ask, so what are you going to do different about this, or how are you going to start investing your time and money? And I think this really kind of gets to the heart of what we're talking about. The traditional classroom-based instructor-led training investment is going to be flat at best. No growth in that area in terms of what companies are going to do in terms of spending time and money. But 65% of the companies in the research that we did said we are going to increase our investment in virtual training. So I think it's interesting and important that we're here today to talk about the fact that companies are considering this change. You're not alone if you're considering this change. It looks like you're in the majority. You're probably considering the change for the very reasons we just described. But I think what we're going to tackle for the rest of this time together, and I think is important, is how do you do that well? Because there's been a lot of promise. Virtual training and online learning has been talked about for 20 years. So I think it's interesting to figure out why now and what's different that will maybe make it more effective.
Great. So, moving on to the next question is, what are the challenges of doing virtual training versus classroom, right? So I am a traditional classroom trainer, obviously working on creating some virtual stuff. So I have some thoughts around it, but I certainly don't need to poison the well with my own perceptions of it. What are you seeing out there, and what are you seeing that's working or not working, that kind of stuff?
Well, we're each poisoning the well, so you're welcome to join the crowd here, Richard. But
Absolutely.
how about, Mike, I go on first on this one with some more data from the study, I think, to give us sort of propel us into this.
You got it.
All right, so this was interesting because when we found out that 65% of companies said we're going to spend more money in virtual, we had to ask the question, so what format or form or modality of training do you think is the most effective for behavior change? The same people who said they're going to spend more time and money in the virtual training realm are the same people who said this, the data that you see in front of you, that 45% of them believed that instructor-led classroom is more effective for behavior change. 39% said that some form of manager-led or in the field, and what you got was 10% who said online is the most effective. This is their opinion, right? This is just a feeling, an opinion question we ask, because it's important to see if you're going to do something different, like invest in virtual, where do you think it's at and where does it need to go? And I think this is what really creates an opportunity for our discussion today, is people who have lived in the traditional world of interactive, application-oriented, workshop-based, stand and deliver, are now looking at virtual as an alternative, and they're a little skeptical. And what we ask in the next question, I think, was really interesting. On the bottom left, you see efficiency. The response that we got in the survey was unanimous almost, that people were talking about training more people on less budget. And so the entire model is being premised on an efficiency objective and doing more training, but doing it more cost effectively, whether that's cost effectively and efficiently by not taking them out of the field and saving that kind of money, as a result touching more people. But I think what we want to talk about is it possible for virtual training to also be more effective and get you closer to your goals, so that people aren't talking about training more for less, they're talking about increasing performance because of the benefits available through virtual training. So I just thought it was interesting, again, that folks are going after the virtual training. They're a little concerned about its effectiveness, but they're sort of justifying it based on efficiency. And I think the dialogue we really need to have is about effectiveness.
Boy, I couldn't agree any more with that from my experience and from focusing on efficiency and effectiveness. To me, if you get effectiveness right, then you can do efficiency and do a whole lot more things effectively. If you get efficiency right first, you could wind up doing a lot of the things that don't produce results a whole lot better, which doesn't really move the needle, does it? So here's what I'd say about the challenges of virtual sales training instead of classroom. If you think that classroom training done poorly doesn't produce results, you're going to get nowhere even faster if you do virtual training poorly. And the key word there is poorly. So don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying we can't have an impact with virtual training. This whole panel discussion is about how we can. I'm just saying that done poorly, virtual training is as bad or worse than classroom training, and you need to think about that going in. What are the big challenges? I see them as boring page-turner online courses and boring, non-engaging live virtual sessions are a huge risk for virtual training. It's a known fact that abandonment rates are still high for e-learning courses. People start them, but they don't complete them sometimes. If you have a complete lack of involvement of the learner, your virtual training is not going to be very effective. If there isn't...
Go ahead, sorry.
If there isn't a validation of knowledge gained through assessments or even simple quizzes or Q&A sessions, that's not going to help you. If you're teaching way too much at once or skipping around on topics rather than having some sort of a chunked, sequenced, and layered instructional design plan, that's going to be a challenge for you. And I think a big one that many even trainers don't think about, teaching people conceptually rather than teaching them in their real workflow can be a problem. And sometimes I think about teaching a word processing software like Microsoft Word. What would be better, right? Showing what's on the menus and ribbons and saying, hey, here's what you can do from file and here's what you can do from edit. Would it be better to say, hey, let's build a document together and then guide them through that hands-on? So teaching people in the context of process and their workflow can make it much more relevant and easy to absorb. Lack of follow-up and no inspections and no coaching, would all be challenges that I think we need to overcome. And the good news is that if we understand what these challenges are, if we want to succeed, we just have to do the opposite.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to jump in on this topic because I've written about this, that there's a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. And really for the last 3 or 4 years, we've all in sales been swallowing the pill of efficiency, right? Whether it's Tout App or a specific dialer or sales loft. And those tools are needed. Those tools to me are now table stakes. If you don't have them, then you're not going to win. You're going to have a much harder time. And that the challenge I see back to Mike's point is, and this is something that we focus on in our training, is, I want to spend 10 minutes explaining a theory to the sales team, but then I want to spend 30 minutes going, okay, well, what does that sound like in a Brainshark sales conversation? What words are you using? What words are your prospects using? And so to me, that's the one thing that as the virtual stuff picks up, I really want it to be contextual, right? Everybody loves to say content is king, but it's not going to be the content of the virtual training that matters. It's going to be the context. Context is king, or content is king, but context is the kingdom. And so that's the piece that I really hope, as we continue to grow with this virtual training piece, that we start to see coming out of the technologies. So,
yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. So, how do we mitigate these challenges, right? Like, there's a ton of stuff out there. There's lots of ways to try and peel this onion. Where do you start? How do you make sure that you do the right thing? And I think the key answer that I'm sort of hoping for is, before you just decide on a platform or a tool or whatever, what process do you need to go through to help make sure you don't make some of these mistakes?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key. And I talk a lot about this graphic that you see up on the screen here. It's entirely possible to make sales training highly effective and virtual sales training effective if you stop thinking of the training as something that lives in a vacuum, right? And so that's why I say you need an effective learning system, not just online courses or a virtual event. And by the way, this framework is no different than what we should be doing for classroom training. There are just some differences in each of these buckets, though, for virtual training. So, all of these are still important as you look around this wheel. For example, if you don't teach the right content, that will make a difference if it's used in the field. It really won't matter how effective the rest of your system is. But these 4 buckets that I've highlighted here do require some special attention, I feel, for implementing virtual sales training effectively. And those buckets are instructional design, manager engagement, training transfer, and coaching to mastery. And instructional design is a real science. This is where it comes into play. So here are some things to think about. For virtual training, you really need to have bite-sized focused modules in your online courses, ones with really clear objectives that are action-oriented, like what Richard was saying, right? Get them doing something. What's it sound like? And focused on what you want the rep to be able to do. Then you can chunk like topics together. You can sequence them in a way that makes sense, like the workflow thing I mentioned. Then you can layer those bite-sized modules into courses and curricula that teach competencies and skills that you can validate, right? Things like how do you handle a customer concern, or how do you use a strategic discovery process, or maybe even how do you personalize and structure a solution dialogue based on what you learned during discovery. Those are real things you need them to do, right? So you can also quiz and assess learners along the way and then track those assessment scores to validate that learning is occurring. And you've got to find a way to reinforce the content because people simply can't do what they can't remember, right? The other thing, and you can use virtual instructor-led sessions for more complex topics. Get them out of the e-learning into real dialogue, for topics that require interaction, live demos, right, Q&A. And in some cases, depending on the virtual training tools you use, you can even role play online or in breakout sessions now. And there are other softwares that you can use to create simulations that actually will test a rep's judgment and skill. So you can also use virtual coaching software. We've got that. You can validate that the reps can actually use and show you that they can do it. At the end of the day, you need to be finding ways other than classroom training to provide this sort of skill practice and then actually validating the rep's skill levels. Some of it can be done by sales enablement staff or coaches, but you've got to get the sales managers involved if you really want to drive change at the frontline level. So, you can have managers validate content so they buy in. You can train them so they understand what their reps are learning so they can reinforce it. And then they can help their reps with transfer, which simply means applying what they've learned in these courses on the job. That way the managers can identify how well the reps are using the skills and when they're not, and coach them to mastery over time. And so it's this baton handoff of like right over the classroom, avoiding it from the online world and taking it into how you're going to use this stuff in the real world and get coaching from your managers. So if you're interested in this effective learning system thing, when you get the slides, there's a link at the bottom there. And if you want more info on creating blended learning curriculums, if you go to my profile on LinkedIn and you look at some of the articles I've written, scroll through there, and there's one about creating effective blended curricula for sales, and hopefully that might help. Tim, I know you've got to have something to say on this topic, right?
Well, here's the thing that I'll build this out for everybody real quick, that I've sort of seen as the pivot point for when virtual training becomes more effective and the opportunity to even be more effective than classroom training. And it has to do with something Richard said, that this idea of context being the kingdom. The struggle I see with a lot of training today as it's currently laid out is it's what I call arbitrary learning paths, where you choose a set of trainings that someone should go through because of their tenure, how long they've been with the company. Are they onboarding? Is it year 1? Is it year 2? Or role. Are they an inside seller, an SDR, or are they an account executive? Are they an account manager? Are they a strategic account manager? And there's these plans developed, and these plans are identified based on the role or tenure of a rep. And I argue that those are pretty arbitrary, and that effectiveness lives at a layer deeper than this. But the layer deeper than this can only be effectively reached with good virtual modular content. And let me explain that with this next slide. I've got 4 ideas for improving virtual training that if we had the time, it would consume the entire 45 minutes. I've recently did a webcast, and I built these 4 ideas out more than I'm about to, but if people want to go deeper on what they hear, I'm going to send a link out as a follow-up to that webcast, because there's a lot going on here in these 4 ideas I'm about to share. But here's what I think the opportunity is when you have virtual learning, and this is going to presume that the people listening have started to create virtual content or found content partners that bring virtual modular content to the table. The idea here is that tenure and rep, arbitrary learning paths, don't take into account the actual performance of that salesperson. They arbitrarily assign you to some sort of teaching because of the job you have or how long you've been around. When in reality, there's enough data out there right now from your sales automation systems that could help you identify, based on performance indicators, where your salespeople are struggling. So imagine that tomorrow you identified a cluster of salespeople who clearly are not developing enough pipeline to hit their number because you know what their close rates are, but look at them. They don't have enough pipeline. They shouldn't go into some generically assigned training for an account executive. They need skills to help build pipeline and get more traction in the pipeline. What you need to be doing tomorrow is pushing to them some virtual content that has been proven as a skill or competency to increase pipeline traction. Or let's say it's not pipeline. Let's say you look at your SFA or CRM and you identify a whole cluster of salespeople who are stuck at stage 3 of the sales process. They have dozens and dozens of accounts and proposals out there that are simply stuck. I like to say their pipeline is constipated. So they don't have a pipeline building problem. They have sort of a proposal problem where they can't pass muster with the executive and financial buyer. That's a different set of competencies and skills. And if you can see that on the CRM, you can push those people the appropriate training because the performance indicators say this is their need. Or at the end, you see at the end of the sales cycle, here's a cluster of sales reps who are unscrupulously discounting. And you could push them some negotiation skills. The idea of making training more effective is by improving the context with which training is delivered. And if you can identify performance indicators as opposed to tenure or role-based learning paths, now you're onto something, a custom learning path based on performance. The other thing is, you talked about a little bit, assessments. The idea is if you have a competency model out there, the next most important thing you can do is build an assessment to identify between the manager and the reps which of those competencies they are or aren't strong in by comparison to their peers. And we've had experience building these types of assessments. And the idea being is, instead of, again, your tenure or your role driving the learning plan, it should be your needs. So your needs are assessed, and now you've identified competency gaps. And in the past, you might have had to sign somebody up for some training, and they had to wait 6 months to get there. Well, here you identify that gap, and with virtual, you push it to them, saying, here's the needs we identified, here are the things you should study. Virtual training can be more effective because it's more timely, it's just in time, as long as you conduct a good needs assessment based on your competency model. The other way virtual training can become more effective, not just efficient, is the idea that you should surface your training inside of your CRM system right during the sales process. In adult learning, we refer to this concept as deficit learning. You and I, all of us, learn better when we are in some sort of deficit, and now we need it and want it. And when you're in the middle of a sales cycle and you're somewhere in your sales process, landing on a stage in your opportunity manager, now all of a sudden I'm willing to maybe watch a 10 to 15 minute and engage in an interactive e-learning module that helps me. So if there's a module on the first 5 minutes with an executive decider, and you know you're in stage 3 and you're about to put a proposal on the table, you might watch that because now I need that. And that again is a problem. When I get training and it's scheduled 6 months down the road, and I get it because I'm just scheduled to get it because that's what everybody in my job title gets, there's no context for that. But here, and no deficit that you're in. The only deficit you're in is I just got taken out of the field. Here you're in a deficit because I need to be effective at this stage of the opportunity. Now I might be interested. So imagine a window underneath your opportunity manager opening up, and there's some thumbnails you could click on with provocative titles that tell you, here are some skills in short bursts that you can learn to help you in this part of the sales process and this stage of the opportunity. And that's all possible with virtual learning. The problem with most virtual learning is people have used it as a one-for-one trade-off with classroom. You went through the classroom last time, now let's give you this entire set of modules and you could do a self-paced virtual learning program. When in reality, it isn't a one-for-one trade-off. There's so much more power in the virtual content. The last idea I'm going to quickly go over is this idea of product or play-specific learning paths. We're seeing a lot of companies who have 80, 100, 200 products relying on sales plays, and they consolidate a strategy for the market or an initiative that combines 7 or 8 products into one big idea, and they call it a sales play. And what's interesting, though, is that you can put messages together and content together and hope the salesperson understands how to run that sales play. But there might be skills required to be effective at that sales play. For example, we work with companies who are trying to launch a major disruption into the market. You can give the salesperson new messages and new content assets, but if they don't really know how to have a disruptive conversation, which is a skills thing, they might struggle in adopting and using that stuff. Why not package virtual modules into a sales play, again, when a salesperson's in a deficit learning mode, and help that person come up to speed on the skills as well as the stories for that sales play. A different sales play might be a more commoditized market where you're trying to gain some share and differentiate and protect your margins and pricing because it's a more commoditized market. That requires different skills to negotiate effectively and distinguish you from the competition. And that sales play could be packaged with other virtual training elements for that kind of selling scenario and that deficit that you're in. Virtual training is not a one-for-one replacement for classroom, and if you're doing it that way, it's going to be efficient but not effective. Here's 4 ideas for making it more effective, and it all has to do with context and delivering it just in time, not waiting for the class to be scheduled 6 months down the road only to have a travel ban show up and you can't go anyway. So hopefully this was helpful. Like I said, I'll send a link to a deeper dive into each of these ideas.
Yeah. And actually, we've got a couple of questions. One question I want to let the person who asked know we're going to get to it, which is, what platforms do you recommend for this virtual kind of training? I know we'll talk about that at the end or in a couple of slides. But another great question that came, which is, do these suggestions apply when you're still just building out a training program? And the reason they're asking this question is because it seems like roles and tenure provide a good foundation to training materials. So I'll let you each sort of take a stab at that and how you want to answer it. Let me know if you need me to repeat it.
Mike, I'll let you take on some of the technology stuff. You're more of a technology guy, I'm more of a content guy, so maybe we can split these.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, on the tech side, we're going to talk a little bit about building a stack to support this. But Brainshark offers stuff to help develop really great e-learning. There are a couple of other key leaders in the market, or Articulate does a great job with that. You can build stuff flat out and in other softwares rather than authoring systems. But authoring systems probably the easiest, fastest, cheapest, as long as you're designing great learning with them. Before I pass the ball back to you, Tim, though, I was clapping over here at these 4 ideas, right? So absolutely phenomenal content. And I'll share a quick story that at GE, when I worked there, we used a system called Skill Director, which I thought was fascinating. You took the sales competencies and loaded into it. You had the rep assess themselves on those competencies on a Likert scale, maybe 1 to 5. You could change that. Then you had the manager assess each of the reps on the same competencies, and they either aligned or they didn't, which created some great conversations. But then even better, right, based on how you determine a break point with a rating, like if it's below a 3, that you want to take some training, it would actually generate a learning path for them. And then they could have this, some of those might have been classroom-based, but a lot of them were on-demand e-learning or virtual instructor-led sessions that would get set up frequently. So I've seen some of these ideas put into action and seen it work really well.
So real quickly on the technology piece, I agree. Some people that we're working with will build their module. For example, they'll build either a Brainshark module if they have it, or they'll build a storyline articulate file. They'll place it in their LMS, and they have their LMS linked to their CRM, and they can situationally pop things in there, or they can make things into kits and push them to salespeople using these virtual modules. So there's a number of strategies, and Michael will address that a little bit later. The one about roles and responsibility and tenure, I do agree. There's a baseline that's in there that I think for companies who are putting maybe their first learning model together. But the thing I was getting to is that you want the adult learner to respond. You want them to be eagerly embracing the training. And if it's arbitrarily assigned because you're a certain tenure with the company, but maybe you're a rep that's had 20 years experience, you might be going through things and kind of checking out of things because of your experience. There's no deficit there. At least you don't perceive there to be one. And the same thing with a role. There's a projection of what you need to learn or know in this role that doesn't have anything necessarily to do with what this person actually is deficient in. And so while I'm not against arbitrary learning paths based on tenure and role, because you got to have something firmly established, all I'm saying is in the future for virtual learning and adult learning patterns, deficit learning and context is really the way you get someone to care. And also, as Mike said earlier, getting involved in the work stream where the stuff kind of comes to them in process, as opposed to being an outlying moment where they go off the grid and have to deal with it, versus them seeing it immediately applicable to something that they're doing. And that's where a sales play-based learning path where you ingratiate it. They have probably a quota attached to that sales play. Their own revenue is dependent on it, or in the opportunity manager scenario I prescribed, or their performance indicators. These are all things that are inextricably and viscerally linked to their success, and it's in that moment that they need it. And I just am painting a picture of a future that I think is something we all have to be leaning into to advance the cause and make the most of and take the most advantage of the flexibility of virtual options.
That's great. That's a really, really solid answer for both of you. I've had a couple people suggest that they've had trouble with audio, so if anybody's having audio troubles, please chat to us or send a question, assuming you can actually hear me asking this question. So what are the sales stacks that can be combined, right? So there's a multitude of things that you can do for virtual training, right? I assume there are platforms that do virtual training. There are pieces of other platforms that can add to that virtual platform. You obviously have your CRM like Salesforce or Pipedrive or any of the others. What are, let's talk about the sales stack that can help with this virtual training, maybe independently of purchasing another tool if you've seen some things cobbled together. And then, of course, obviously, these are the ones that we highly recommend. So.
Sure, yeah. So this is Mike. I've gotten questions about this in other webinars I've done. So I created this slide as an example that I share with people. And keep in mind, I'm talking about an effective learning system, as you see up in the right, in ways in software that exists today that can support the various aspects of that, not just the tools that you use to build e-learning or virtual training. It starts in the lower left for me, right? You've got to have the content that works. And so let's say you take content from Tim's company, Corporate Visions, right? And then you need to either develop or get from your vendors the training itself, right? Doing all of the things designed the way that I've talked about, addressing the deficiency needs and things that Tim has talked about. But but one of the things that we do obviously is we help people take their content, turn it into e-learning. But you need to be able to train. You need to be able to assess them, right? And know what the reps have learned, and then you need to be able to track completions and make sure that people are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. If you look at number 2, right, just down below that, I've got sustain and guide, right? This is to sustain the knowledge and guide managers on what reps need help with. And one company I see doing this really well is QStream. They're a great example of a learning reinforcement system, but there's also Exonify, MindMarker, Count5's got a product called Q Mindshare, and there are others that do exist, right? So I'm just a fan of QStream personally, but they send out questions after you take a course. You answer those questions, you find out is your answer right or wrong and why, and were the other answers right or wrong and why. And then sometimes you can even link to additional support or documents or training on that concept, because people can't use something they can't remember, right? So this kind of fights the forgetting curve. If you look back up at number 3, right, validate and coach, a virtual coaching tool can be used here to really validate and hone how the reps are using the skills that you've taught. Now, we can certainly help with that, and there are a handful of other virtual coaching tools on the market now. If you move over to 4, it's transfer and support. So this is helping reps use the content in their workflow, either by serving up the content at the right time for review to help reps prepare, or enabling easy access to a playbook like Tim's talked about when they need it. It'll help reps use what they learned on the job. Right, and we play in this space, and HighSpot, which I actually plugged in later, can also do this sort of thing really well. If you move down to number 5, I've got 2 options here. There are at least 2 companies that I know of who are doing what I refer to as game film recordings. ExecVision does it for Inside or SD reps, and they record calls through a PBX, and they slice it and dice it and serve it up to you for review and feedback. It's annotated. You can get to specific pieces and offer feedback on one specific thing that was said. Spearfish has some cool technology that does that same sort of thing for field reps, right, through an iPad recording. So both of these companies actually start to go beyond the readiness and prep piece to now actually allow you to review game film of live sales interactions and coach them, even though you might not physically have been able to be there. If you move to the right of that for 6, right, you have a chance to support all of this by providing sales asset management or content management and serving up the right content at the right time, but now for reps to share with their buyers, right, which is something that our partner HighSpot does and a host of other companies are doing today. So that's just one picture, right, but it's a sense more importantly than the vendors of where in the effective learning system you can support people learning the skill, making sure it's the right skill, validating and coaching that skill, sustaining it so they remember it, helping them use it on the job, and then serving it up to them in context. And I think this is one way to support an effective learning system and allow you to go with virtual sales training without sacrificing results.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one too a little bit. So I know ExecVision. In fact, to the prep for this call that I was supposed to be on 15 minutes early before we started this webinar, I was actually doing a coaching session with ExecVision. So using their tool and talking about giving some live feedback. So I'm a big fan of Steve Richard over there at ExecVision. There's also another tool out there called Chorus AI that's doing very similar kinds of things. And I think what you're going to start to see in the future very soon is the ability to predict the outcome of a sales call based on the language that was used in a current sales call. So you're scripting, and I know people hate to say the word script, but in all honesty, we all use a sales script. We say the same stuff over and over again. We just don't want to write it down and admit it as salespeople. But you're going to be able to continually improve and perfect your script and pitch, not just for your own organization, but per rep. You are going to be able to allow that personality piece to let the rep say it the way they want to say it, which I think is going to be tremendously empowering to sales reps and going to make them want more coaching to know, if they say that, gosh, I say this word 6 times and that deal never moves forward to the next meeting, but if I change it to this word, it moves the deal forward, guess what the rep's going to do? They're going to change the word, right? Like it's real cool where it's coming. I got a couple more questions coming from the audience, so I'd love to go ahead and sort of stop the presentation side and ask this. When let me go through, because let's see. Question regarding getting participant involved in learning during the work stream, right? Do you see this, right? And I think this goes back to the question of, sort of that contextual in the CRM moment. Do you see this model working and being workable in a retail environment, right? Totally different industry than maybe some of us are in this inside sales, right? Have you seen anything like that where your sales rep isn't always in front of a computer, like an inside salesperson? Do you see this model working that way?
So I'll take a first shot at that, guys. So we haven't done it, but I certainly could project it. So what's interesting is we've built training content, modular training content based on specific competencies and designed them to show up at the right time and an opportunity. There's been 10 to 15 minute highly engaging interactive versions, as well as 60 to 90 second sort of bursts that we built the range, right? And all available on a mobile platform as well. And so I don't see any reason why there couldn't be situationally pushed or presented, whether it's 60 to 90 second video driven with maybe a little Q&A in it or a quick example, or a more engaged learning module, 10 to 15 minutes with the same sort of but more elaborate interaction working in a retail setting. If I'm picturing somebody in front of a customer and they pull up their phone to get a quick video, I'm not seeing that. But I certainly see people looking at learning, and the term people have been using is micro-learning, situationally presented, right? And I think there's a lot of room for that as we've been building the range of content from 60-second bursts to 20-minute modules. That's very plausible. I think there's a lot of merit to that. We just haven't engaged in that, but I would support it.
Yeah, I've actually got a client that focuses on employee engagement. And because everybody's absorbing everything on their mobile device, it's how does the company stay engaged with their employees? And so from a high level, this would be one of those ways, right? You can provide your people in the factory, you can provide people in on the retail floor in a restaurant, bits and pieces and snippets that not only trains them, but then it also, if it's done properly, makes them loyal to their company. They're like, wow, my company's investing in me, and I don't have to go to a classroom to do it. I can just do it on my phone. I can do it in my commute. I can do it in all these different places. So I agree with you 100% on that one.
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of B2C experience, but I worked with a client back in 2002 when I was probably a lot thinner and had more hair, sadly. And they were retail, and they were training people in a back room. They weren't obviously on mobile devices at that point, but they, a lot of times they were on a laptop, taking some training, and they did the best they could to connect that training to the front line. So they would do something relatively brief in the back, and they'd come out on the floor and have to try what they learned, and with their manager not far away, listening, observing, to provide some feedback. And that was a really great way where they connected the training to the real world. They did it relatively quickly. It was almost in real time. People got immediate feedback on how something worked or didn't, or what to do differently, and that worked really well for that company.
That's great. I've got a couple more questions if you guys don't mind.
No.
How do you schedule this this training cognitive of the rep's field time, right? Like, I love this piece about the virtual ability to do it in that sales piece, but with the field reps, maybe share some feedback around, one, is it one more thing for them to monitor? Is it, does it get in the way of the other things that might be in the CRM? Although, at this stage you can sort of be very specific about where you put things. How do you make sure that it's being done, as you often have some sales reps who, they never want to take sales training, right? Because they think they know it all. How are you seeing that to be conscious of the rep's field time versus the administrative time it takes to do this in the virtual world?
Tim, do you have an example based on your 4 reasons about how a client's implementing that?
Yeah, I think that it becomes ironic that the main reason people are going to virtual is to save time for salespeople, and now we're concerned that virtual, how do we manage the time for the salespeople to use virtual? So first of all, it's chunked, and so you're providing a key concept or competency at a time in 10, 15-minute interactive modules with questions and quizzes and examples and practice and deeper dive sort of things. So there's a self-pacing to it, right? And so that's one way. This is simply just more consumable in chunks and fits and starts, designed to help be available to when a salesperson needs it, and what they need, and as much as they need at the moment they need it. and that last part being the key. We've just discovered that if a salesperson feels they need it, they're more apt to use it. And I think the concern there, or the question there is, there's always time for something you feel you need, right? And so we're gathering more data on this, but the good news is when you assign a key, a license key to a particular rep, you know what they've watched. You know how much of it they've watched, and you can spit out reports, and their managers can know that, they can know that, and they can know everybody knows that. So I think the thing with virtual that's interesting is that there's so much more you can do with analytics. You could have someone go to a class, and you have no idea if they spent time on their smart ear manager, if they spent time on their phone, or spent time on their computer doing other things, or if they even made it into the room. Hopefully maybe they signed in and out. But the bottom line is there's more analytics here too to tell us more stuff. And I'm very keen on this idea too, is because you're providing things either based on performance indicators, the key is measurement afterward. You can actually see if the needle moved. And so that you have before and after sort of measurements when you say, I'm going to give this to you situationally, how well did people adopt and deliver on that new sales play? And then you can look at their consumption of the training and correlate it to performance. So the opportunities now with the data that you have to correlate and corroborate things and be able to say, listen, the people who spent the most time on the skills training seem to be having the most success with this sales play. You might want to go back and spend a little more time, Sally or Bob, because it appears based on the data I'm getting as your manager, you've spent the least amount of time on my team on this. So I just think there's way more knowledge we're going to have, not to overwhelm anybody with data, but the power is going to be there that I think the inspection and knowledge of whether people are taking it and whether it's working and connecting those dots is going to be way more prevalent than in the past.
Great. We've got a couple more questions, but I do want to sort of get back to the presentation. Hopefully we'll get to all these questions, and I'll even leave it to the panelists. Do you guys just want to keep answering their questions? It might be more fun to answer the audience questions than your own, but it's your content. What would y'all like to do?
I think this is a good question, though, that I got to believe somebody in the audience is asking. So let's try and answer this question, Mike. What do you think, real quick? And then see if we've covered off on anybody's. But it's the whole idea of managers actually coaching because of the dependency on managers in so many cases. And is there anything that happens differently in a virtual training environment for the role of the manager? Mike, what do you think? Should we quick cover off on this one?
I would say we do this one and then answer whatever questions the audience has.
Right.
Tim, you want to
yeah, I'll
take this
start
one?
because I got a piece of data on this one. That's another reason I find data so much fun to be a jumping off point here. And here's the interesting data. So part of our research in the marketplace, we ask, and I don't think this is any surprise that salespeople think they're important, but we first ask the question of salespeople, when it comes to differentiation and being able to convince customers to choose you, how important is the sales conversation relative to the quality of the product or the price of the product? And 85% of the respondents in our survey said the sales conversation is really the last bastion of competitive differentiation. That what the salesperson says is the differentiation anymore. But then we ask the question, so how often then are you expected to practice and get coached on your messaging, the things you're saying to the customer, proving that you actually can have good customer conversations? And only 41% of the respondents said that there's some formalized practice in coaching where there's some expectation that they should demonstrate a level of proficiency. And then we ask, how many of you actually get formally certified on the skill and the ability to deliver a conversation or message effectively? And that number drops to 9%. So in organizations where they're reliant on this moment of truth, 85% believe it. Cut that in half to say anybody's actually expected to practice it and somebody's going to monitor that, and only 9% expect any badging or formal level of certification. So I think there's a lot of hoping that things are going to go well in this all-important customer conversation. That part in the middle where I have less than 1/4, I think, is the real interesting takeaway. So for 3 years, we've been measuring 90 days after sales training with our clients, the percentage of managers that are coaching to a high degree And so the question is, how often does your manager coach you on the new skills and content you were just trained on? And only 23% of managers were given grades that they coach 75% or more of the time using the skills that were just taught, meaning actually reinforcing them. 23%. We recently did a very hardcore program to give managers all kinds of additional assets and tools and told them they were going to be monitored, and came back and asked the sales reps, to what degree did your managers coach you? And we were able to move the needle to 31% from 23%. Now, what I would tell you is that's a 30+% increase, and I could tell you how you can get a 30% increase in your sales managers doing the job of coaching, but that still means 69% of managers simply didn't, even when presented all kinds of new assets and ideas and technologies and moments to coach to. So this is a real conundrum for people, and you know, I think the idea here, to be honest, if I just kind of quickly go to the next slide, is that if you look out at the end of this thing, is that you can go through a blended classroom, you could go through a flipped classroom, or you can go virtual, but at some point you got to do it. You got to practice it. And one of the things we're looking at is what can be done to virtually reinforce in context, because managers are inherently unreliable. Not unreliable as professionals, not unreliable as managers, but unreliable change agents, and unreliable in terms of really owning responsibility for reinforcing what was taught in the classroom. So it is my opinion that the virtual environment, and Mike mentioned some of the technologies like QStream and others to do quizzing and dripping and mobile bursts and memory boosts, are going to have to be really important, and virtual gives you the opportunity to do it, because as important as managers are, and as important as we think they are important for everything you try to execute in the field, and skills training is just one more thing. And I think that you can pretty much expect that even with intense effort to get your managers to do it, you could still end up with 70 to 75% not doing it. And to give you one last stat, if you're coached to a high degree on the new skills, we've shown that salespeople will adopt and apply the skills 25.4% more often. So coaching is correlative to adoption, and adoption is correlative to success. And so you're going to have to coach somehow when your managers can't be counted on. So I think the virtual environment is important for coaching and virtual coaching, and gives you the flexibility to do that, knowing your managers are still going to struggle. They just are. I don't care how many programs you put in place.
Boy, you couldn't have possibly set me up any better, Tim, and I agree 100% with that. So here's what I talk about as the 4 pillars for getting sales training ROI through manager engagement, right? And you'll recognize these are elements of the effective learning system that I shared earlier. So I'm not saying the rest of the system is unimportant, but after you know that the sales training content will make a difference, these other 3 elements are the ones that will allow you to get results through a partnership with your frontline sales managers. So the next thing is the knowledge sustainment piece, right? So this is how you're really assessing retention of what was taught over time, because people simply can't use what they forget. So you can test to do that. You can consider a system like QStream, which also then gives you the analytics to point your managers at the places where their reps actually need the reinforcement and coaching. So if the managers aren't just being asked to go reinforce everything with everybody, but you're able to pinpoint them toward someone who needs help with something to get better results, you're a lot more likely to get the managers engaged, right? So that's the knowledge sustainment piece. The next pillar is the skills transfer piece, right? And as Tim said, sooner or later, they've got to practice, right? And so this is where you can validate the rep can actually use the skills, because even if they remember it, it doesn't mean they're going to do it. So there, you know, role play is an old standard, and I as somebody who came out of a music background who spent hours in a practice room, and I'm not a sports guy, but I've heard every sports analogy in the free world, I still don't understand why we have a hesitancy toward using role play as a tool to help people get better at what they do. And today we've got the option of virtual coaching, right, where skills can be practiced, recorded, submitted, reviewed, verified, coached. I mean, it is a phenomenal excuse remover where you can validate that your reps actually can do something. Now it's a matter of will they go do it, right? And this is the way to prove reps can do it in a safe simulated setting. Then you can help them apply it with buyers or customers, and that reduces the thing that happens after training, where someone goes out and they try a new skill on a buyer. They don't do a very good job because, I mean, after all, who becomes an expert after sitting in a training class one time or taking an online course? And then because it doesn't work well, they start to creep right back into their old behaviors and no change happens at all. So you can also support this with, I saw something on Tim's slide about this, so you can pipe in if you want, Tim, but I used to use the term manager toolkits or meetings in a box, and I'd create these guides that would help managers run sessions after classes for critical topics to ensure that their teams were using the forums online or otherwise, that they were preparing to apply these skills in sales calls, right? And that's one way that you can support your managers in getting them involved. The fourth pillar, then last one, right, is coaching to mastery, because even if they remember it and they try it, doesn't mean they're going to do it well out of the gate. There's the big risk here, again, of reps struggling to use new skills and then abandoning them. So, you know, you can role play and coach frequently. You continue with video coaching. Obviously, you can do field visits and phone observations, but then you can, you know, you make sure you can use a game film system like ExecVision or Spearfish, or Richard mentioned another one that I've got to get that from you at the end, Richard. What is it?
Chorus AI.
Core SAI, thank you.
Chorus, Chorus.
Oh, Chorus, got it. So Chorus SAI, right, some type of game film system where you can go beyond the practice and observe and coach more live sales interactions without actually having to be there. So if you can plug these type of things in to help your managers and support them, it becomes easier to get them engaged and actually doing some of the reinforcement. And as Tim pointed out earlier, if you're measuring all of these things and you're able to take that back to the managers and compare it to their team's performance, compare it to someone else's performance where they're blowing out of the water and they're doing these things, you can start to build momentum and helping people change their behaviors.
Great, that's awesome. So got time for maybe one more quick question. There's a lot of moving parts to all this kind of stuff, right? So who integrates all these pieces, creates all these pieces, and how do you make it available for, you know, a smaller company? And that might be a separate question, but, you know, it's one thing to have all this great content and context around the content, but, you know, you've got to put this data or this information into the virtual platform. Who do you see owning that piece? Is that a sales thing? Is it a sales ops piece? Is it a marketing piece? What are you guys seeing?
Well, that's the $100,000 question, right? Because even amongst sales enablement professionals, if you ask 10 of us, you know, what the role is, it's you know, you're going to get 9 different answers. So right. I think very often it should sit in sales enablement. If that function is supported by instructional designers or trainers, or you can outsource some of that, that's helpful. You know, if you have organizational coaches, or you can outsource to a degree for coaching. I worked in one company where in our onboarding program we were putting so many people through because we were in a growth mode. Managers couldn't possibly keep up with doing this knowledge sustainment, skills transfer, and coaching to mastery for all of the new people and still run their current teams. So we actually hired coaches internally. And we had coaches who guided the reps through their first couple days, first couple months, on the job, and then turned them back over to the manager once they were up and running. And the manager didn't abdicate responsibility during that phase, but they obviously couldn't do everything. So I would put it squarely in sales enablement, supported by sales training, if they have that function. What are you seeing, Tim?
Yeah, I think I'm seeing that, and I guess the most interesting and enlightened experience I just had was an organization where they brought us into the room, and the sales training lead was on one side of the desk, and so the head of sales had brought these 2 people in, the go-to-market strategist and the sales training lead, and he basically pronounced that standalone skills training is out of fashion at their company, and that it will all be context-based. And he had the strategist in the room because that person was in charge of sales plays, and he had the training lead in the room because he says all training will be contextualized to the plays, and now and forevermore, it will happen in situationally like that. And so somebody's got to make the call, And then I think then you got people who can work together, but somebody with some authority, this being the head of all of sales for 4,000 reps, inside sellers, right, in 5 hubs, said, we don't have classrooms even available to do classrooms. My sellers are selling virtually, so we're going to train virtually, but we're going to train virtually contextually to the play, as one of the examples I shared with you. And they had training in the room and go-to-market strategy in the room because they both had to work together to make this happen. And in their case, they were going to use an interactive content platform, let's say an interactive playbook, and that playbook would then house the messages and the content assets that the sales play creator built and the virtual training modules, all organized in this interactive playbook using an interactive content platform, and this would be sent out to the reps. So it would be structured, and that would be the container in this case, and the company's going to do 7 of these for the next year, and that's how they were going to deliver it. So lots of moving parts yet. I totally agree with the question, and I empathize with the question, but that's what I'm starting to see is that the training department's talking, the skills department's talking to the stories department, and what we're going to have is a future where the stories and the skills are one thing, and they're going to happen situationally.
Yeah.
That's great.
You know, Tim, if you have, there's an old quote that says, if you have faith as a grain of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. And what they left out of that for business was you also need top-down support.
Yes, this will happen because of this guy's edict, yes.
So, well, that's great. Hey, I just want to, before I know we're going to give everybody a minute to figure out how to get in touch with both of you, but I do want to remind folks of our next session is December 14th, next week at 11 a.m. It'll be how to combine data with the intuition to close more sales, and that's going to be sponsored by Insight Squared, and we're going to be speaking with their VP of Sales, Steve McKenzie. So if you haven't signed up for that, please go to the website and do so. For those folks that do want to get in touch with you, Tim and Mike, how can they do that? Mike, why don't we go ahead and start with you? You're the host of the show, or the sponsor of the show, so a big thanks to Brainshark. But if people want to get in touch with you or Brainshark, what's the best way to do that?
Brainshark.com is the easiest way to find out stuff about our company and the sales enablement solutions we offer. You can see here that I'm at Mike_Kunkle on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. If you mention this webinar in your invite, I'd be happy to connect with you if this is the kind of stuff you're interested in. Or if you go to MikeKunkle.com/connect, you will see all of the places that I hang on social media, and we can get connected anywhere you'd like.
Tim, how about you?
All right, thanks, Mike and Richard. Yeah, Corporate Visions, all one word, corporatevisions.com. My Twitter handle is here, but that's a good place to start. There are a lot of resources, video-based resources on the research that we do. And I would also alert people that I'm going to send a link to the deeper dive on all 4 of those big ideas. So that webcast, recorded webcast, will be coming your way as well. And I encourage you to take a look at it if you're interested in more details on that.
Great. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been a very lively conversation, and I also want to thank the audience for submitting some awesome questions and participating as well as they did. So thank you very much. We look forward to hearing from everybody on the next one. Take care.
Thanks and bye.